tuned in to the Community Cats podcast. Ready? Let's go.
All right, we're going to get on with the presentation. So we have Susan Richmond is the Executive Director of Neighborhood Cats, having served in the role since 2010. She oversees hands-on TNR programs in New York City, Jersey City, and on the island of Maui, as well as her prior Madison Avenue advertising experience. To write, among other things, crowdfunding appeals to help the many sick and injured cats who come Neighborhood Cats' way. One of her favorite projects currently is a veterinary scholarship program designed to train community cat-oriented vets on high-volume spay-neuter techniques. And she's not in the office. You can find Susie out in the fields of Maui, where she recently passed the 1,000 cats trap mark. Bryan Kortis serves as Neighborhood Cats National Program Director and Susie Richmond's husband. Back in 1999, while working in Manhattan as both an attorney and a video director, Bryan co-founded Neighborhood Cats after TNRing a colony near where he lived. Except for a 6-year stint as a grants manager for PetSmart Charities, he has been with the organization ever since. He's authored or co-authored handbooks on grassroots TNR, community TNR, and return to field programs. You can always find him online, where he regularly presents both basic and advanced webinars on all things Trap-Neuter-Return in partnership with the Community Cats podcast. And I'm going to hand it over to Bryan.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy. And thanks everybody for taking time out today to learn more about taking care of our community cats. And when we talk about caretaking for community cats, I think the most important thing to recognize up front is that the bond between the cats and the caretaker is centered around food. Not that they don't love you, not that there aren't other aspects to the relationship, but that tends to be the central thing that joins us together. People come across cats who are in need, and usually they're in need of food. Regular feeding starts to happen, and the bond between the cats and the person starts to form, and then you know that they're there waiting for you each night as part of your routine. So that's what we're going to spend the first part of our webinar today, is really diving into the feeding and the bond that results from that. So the first thing I want to say is everything here is not like you should do it this way, you have to do it this way. We're trying to point out like what's ideal. What should you strive for? What should you do if you can do it? Not all circumstances will allow for everything that we're presenting, and you'll see we'll discuss different options and different approaches. But if you can feed your cats on a regular pattern, then that's going to be the way to go for a number of reasons we'll talk about. So cats, are very habitual creatures. If you've got cats at home, then if normally you're feeding them at 7 a.m, well, good luck on the weekends sleeping in until 9, because if they can get into your bedroom, they are not going to allow that to happen. They will do whatever they can to get you out of bed so that they will eat at their normal time. And cats outside are just the same. So they can be pretty easily trained to show up at the same time and the same place for their meals. So the more specific you can be, the better. So like I said, with your pet cats, you're always feeding them at 7. With your community cats, maybe you're always feeding them at 9, or when you get home from work, or whatever it might be. If you can't be like, oh, hey, it's 5 p.m. and I'm feeding them, then you want to at least narrow the window as much as you can. So always feed them in the morning, or always feed them after dusk. But don't sometimes feed them one time and sometimes feed them another part of the day. You also want to avoid 24/7 feeding, meaning food is always out. Again, if you can avoid that. One tip is you can clicker train or use some unique sound that the cats associate with the feeding. A lot of them will figure it out themselves. Like they actually can recognize the sound of an engine of a specific car. And when they hear that car pulling up, they come out of the bushes and know that it's you. But you can also jingle your keys or shake a jar of crunchies or whistle, whatever it might be. And the reason you want to do that, and the reason you want a feeding pattern in general, is it makes trapping and it makes caretaking much more predictable and therefore much easier. In terms of trapping, if you've got a colony of 15 cats and they're in one neighborhood, or maybe they're at an industrial area, think about you want to get them spayed and neutered. And if they're not on any type of feeding pattern, then how are you going to go about trapping them? Well, you're going to show up at a time of day. Maybe that's convenient for you. And you're going to spread traps all over the place. And you're going to hope they're hungry and you're going to hope they show up. That's not the greatest way to go about it. A better way is they're going to be there at 5 and you know exactly where they're all going to be because they're going to come and gather for their meal. And then you're putting traps in that location at that time. And by the way, the day before you didn't feed them. So now they're really hungry. That's a much, much better trapping situation. Also, having a feeding pattern allows you to monitor the colony. Is there a newcomer? Like we just had a new kitten show up in the back of our building, and not going to be that hard. We know that after dusk, when the feeding usually happens, this kitten's going to show up. And so that's when we're going to put out our drop trap and catch her. We'll set up a half hour before and we'll just wait, put a big bowl of food in the trap and wait for her to show up. So makes monitoring, trapping, everything to do better. The other thing is with a feeding pattern, you can control a lot of the issues that come up with community cats. So you can train them that the food is out at 5 p.m. and the food is gone at 5:30, and they will eat their meal and they'll go on their way. So unless you're somebody who leaves a big bowl of dry food out all day for your pet cats, which is not a particularly good idea in terms of health, because cats are what are called feast or famine animals. You think about a cat in the wild and they don't nibble and graze all day like a cow might. They hunt, they kill, they gorge themselves, and then they may not eat for another 2 or 3 days. So their digestive systems are set up for that. And their digestive systems are triggered by the scent of food. And if food is around all the time, then their digestive systems are always going, and that can lead to kidney disease and different chronic ailments. So in general, when you can feed your cats in discrete time frames, that's going to be healthier for them. And we're probably talking canned food at that point if you're doing maybe some dry. But basically, if you are feeding your community cats and they've eaten and they're done, everything, and you can clean up at 5:30 when you fed them at 5, you can avoid a lot of conflicts with neighbors complaining about food being left out or unsightly or attracting rodents and things like that. Now, again, I completely understand there are situations where you cannot do that and you have to leave food out. And we'll talk about how you handle those too. So by training them to eat in this window of time, you're also avoiding attracting wildlife, which can be, really a big issue in a lot of communities. And like I say, you're not attracting rodents who are coming by to eat whatever food may be around once the cats are done, or because they know there's always a food source there. So like you see this guy here, this little raccoon who's going to come around and, potentially cause issues again with public health, with neighbors and things like that. Now, let's say you are in an area where there are raccoons or other animals and they show up too, right? They're smart. They learn when the window of food is too. Or let's say you're in a situation where you have to leave the food and then come back the next day. You can't hang out. If you're feeding 3 colonies and 50 cats, in the course of the evening, you put the food out and you have to go move on to your next situation. Well, here's a trick for you when you're dealing with opossums or raccoons or skunks or any type of wildlife that may be interested in the cat food. And this is what's called a raccoon-proof feeder. And it's for animals who can climb. Like if you ever seen the claws on a raccoon, they're pretty amazing, but they can't jump vertically. They can actually jump horizontally, but they can't jump up. So this feeder creates a platform. You're up on a platform and then it's surrounded by this metal flashing that the animals can't grab onto. So they can't climb up it. Meanwhile, cats can jump vertically. So you can see on the lower right of this photo, little what's called jumping station. So the cats get up on that and then they jump up onto the platform and they get their food. So just one way to deal with this if you have to. So what if your problem is not raccoons, it's birds? So there's a number of ways to deal with birds getting into the food. Most birds, almost all birds, are diurnal, meaning that they're active during the day and they sleep at night. We have that situation here in Hawaii where there's lots of feral chickens, and the chickens have no fear of the cats. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The cats will back off when the chickens approach, and they're voracious eaters, and they're only out during the day. And when it gets dark, they go up into a tree and they hang out and sleep there all night. So most of the feeding of community cats in Hawaii is right after dark. Now, if you have to put food out during the daytime, one idea is you have a feeding station, meaning a contained area where you put the food and water in. We'll talk more about that. But cover the doorway with these strips of plastic like you see here, because the cats won't have any problem sticking their head in or walking right through that. But the vast majority of birds will not want to pass through those strips. The other idea is we've often done, especially like we've done this when we're trapping and there are birds around, we feed the birds separately. You feed them a food that they like and the cats don't. So like cracked corn or chicken scratch, put a pile of it away from where the cats are eating, and the birds will run over and eat that food instead. So let's talk about nutrition a little bit, because obviously that's an important thing. First thing you need to know is, how do you judge the nutritious content of a cat food, of a particular can or bag of dry food? So this is a very simple approach, and it does get a lot more complicated. So I'm talking about really generalities here, but it's a good place to start. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to look at the ingredients, the list of ingredients. And those ingredients are going to be listed in the order of volume. So whatever ingredient is the most in the food is going to be listed first. So in this case, you see beef, and then second would be beef broth, and then third would be chicken liver, and fourth would be kidney. You don't get to something that's non-meat. Remember, cats are carnivores, so they need meat until you get to rice flour. So I compare that to, you look at a food and the first ingredient is cornmeal, right? So cats really don't get much nutrition from corn. So most of that, the largest ingredient in the food, is not something that's particularly nutritious for them. That's a good rule of thumb, is look at the ingredient label for those things. Grains, if you see the term byproducts, like if it says chicken byproducts, you're thinking, what is that? Right? Well, that's feathers and hooves and the parts of the animal that normally, like, you wouldn't ever have for human consumption, but they just kind of throw it in. And basically, it's a pretty direct relationship when it comes to pet food in general, that you get what you pay for. So more nutritious foods tend to be more expensive. And that's something we'll talk about. How do you balance that? And again, I'm not telling you you should go out and buy the most expensive, most nutritious food. That's not practical for a lot of caretakers. This is about you knowing what you're feeding and then making decisions intelligently based within your means. Now, if you want to learn more, like what's the quality of the meat that goes into it, you can do a much deeper dive than I just did. And like I say, there are books and websites devoted to this if you're interested in learning more about cat nutrition. But those are the basics. So one of the debates that comes up when we talk about cat nutrition is wet food versus dry food. And I like to make it very simple for people about, and again, we're just talking about nutrition. We're not talking about what you're going to be feeding your community cats, but just so you know, you have the information. You look at this slide and you've got a piece of meat on your left that is wet food, right? And then you have that same piece of meat on your right that's been baked to a crisp, and that would be dry food. Now, I'm vegan, so this is a little hard for me, but don't relate to it so well, but if you were going to go out and order a steak, which would you rather have? The steak that is juicy and so-called wet, or would you like to have the charred piece of meat on your right? So obviously, you're going to choose the wet. And that's what dry food versus wet food comes down to. It's dry food is meat that's been baked to a crisp. Now, let me add one thing about the dry food too, just a nutrition tip, is again, you get what you pay for. So the cheaper dry foods, they add, you'll see, they'll say like, well, there's all these added vitamins and things like that. The cheaper ones add them at the beginning before the baking process because it's faster and easier that way. So guess what? A lot of those vitamins get destroyed during the baking process. The more expensive dry foods will bake the meat and then add the vitamins so that they're not burnt to a crisp. So that's why some dry foods are more expensive than others, is the process by which they make them. So now that you have a basic understanding of nutrition, we come down to what are you going to do when you're feeding your community cats? How do you decide? And the formula that we recommend to people is that you choose the best quality and type, wet or dry, that you can comfortably afford. So there are two equally important things going on here. I really want to emphasize that. There's nutrition is important, right? The more nutritious, the healthier, better chance the cats have of being healthy. But your pocketbook is just as important. And so how you strike this balance is going to depend on your circumstances, right? So if you're feeding 4 cats in your backyard and you have a nice, comfortable income and plenty of disposable income to spend, and you can afford to give them high quality canned food on a daily basis, go for it. They'll be better off for it. On the other hand, if you're one of those 18% of people today who's feeding more than 20 cats and you're on a fixed income and you don't have a lot of disposable income, you're basically scraping by right now and hopefully not sacrificing your own well-being, but it's tough for you to get the cats the food they need, then you're going to want to buy dry food because you can get a lot more of it at a much more effective price, a lower price per serving than if you're going out and buying canned food. You can also remember that you can mix a bit. If you're giving mostly dry food, then maybe some canned food once in a while. Even the supermarket brands that are a little less expensive is a good thing to do. So keep that in mind, that you are important too. And we don't want people struggling financially in order to feed the cats. So we also put a list of dry food that in our experience had a really good balance between value and nutrition. So they're not the cheapest. They're not the deli cat or meow mix type of rainbow colored food that's the cheapest, but they're not that expensive and they're relatively good nutrition. And the first on the list there is Kirkland. And Kirkland is Costco's store brand. So is a very good reason to get a Costco card if you don't have one and you're feeding a lot of cats, because you can go get a 25-pound bag of Kirkland Signature for a very good price and really feed a lot of cats that way. And then also Rachel Ray Nutrish and Diamond Naturals are a nice balance between cost and nutrition. Okay, so let's talk about where to feed now that we've talked about what to feed. And our approach at Neighborhood Cats has always been out of sight, out of mind. My first experience taking care of a colony of cats, there was a period of time, and this kitty was one of that colony from over 20 years ago. I had to feed through a fence for a while that was adjoining a sidewalk, and this is the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So a lot of people walking by, a lot of people saw the cat food dish, and every year, 1 or 2 cats would be dumped at that location. When I finally got the trust of the landlord and he let me go into the lot, I immediately went, and as you can see here, I hid the food and the water behind a bunch of rocks further into the lot so people couldn't see the food and the water. And then I had almost, I think maybe 1 in years, cat abandoned there. So also just, again, fewer complaints, the less interest people have who are not caring for the cats, in my experience, the better. You want the cats to be a neutral factor or a positive one, of course. So think about where you would have minimal impact on neighbors or the work site. You want it to be safe and quiet for the cats. It has to be accessible for you. Don't pick a great spot or a feeding station that you can't get to. It won't really do much good. If you're in a location where there's wildlife, especially any that are threatened by cats, ground nesting birds, things like that, try to situate your feeding stations as far away from the wildlife and especially their nesting areas as you can, to avoid conflict. You want to avoid putting the food directly on the pavement or the ground. This is one of my pet peeves, because guess what happens if they don't eat it all, right? It just stays there. And that's going to be a source of complaints. It's going to attract rodents. It's going to attract wildlife, and just really not a good idea. You want to avoid that. So whenever you're feeding, try to put the food on something that you can then pick up when they're done. So plastic plates, cardboard, things like that. Best are stainless steel bowls or dishes. The stainless steel bowls, and anything stainless steel, is going to help prevent feline acne when the cat's chins rub against it. What happens with plastic is over time they get little microscopic chips or scratches or things like that, and then bacteria collect there, and then the cats rub their chins against them, and they get feline acne, whereas that doesn't happen with stainless steel. The only thing about stainless steel bowls is if you're in a cold climate in the wintertime, you don't want to use them at that time, because if it gets below freezing, you don't want your cat's tongues getting stuck to metal or anything like that. And that is a real thing that can happen. Also think about if you're going to be there for the whole time, and when the feeding ends, then you're going to pick up your plates and clean the place up. But if you're in a situation where you can't stick around, then you want to make sure you're using containers that aren't going to blow around and make a mess everywhere. And you're probably going to want a feeding station, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the number one complaint against community cat caretakers and feeders is that it's a mess. And it's not that hard to keep the site clean. So always keep that in mind. You want to as spotless as possible. And I know one of the things that I always did was I picked up all the trash that was in the area. I didn't say to myself, well, that's my trash. That's not my trash, so I'm going to leave it here. Because think about the person walking by. They're not saying, oh, well, the people feeding the cats are very neat. They're not a problem. It's somebody else who's making the place a mess. No, they just see a mess, and then they see cats, and then they associate the two together. So it's always better to keep the place clean, and don't try to classify trash as belonging to you or not. It's just trash. Don't leave bags of trash or any kind of container that the cats can open or rip open that has any scent of food inside, because they will. If you leave a bag of trash in a garbage bag that has some leftover food or an empty can, the cats will rip it open and, of course, make quite a mess. And then the bags can be a threat to wildlife who get caught in it or get it wrapped around them or get stuck inside it. So if you're going to have trash on the site, it should be in a trash can or some type of container that the cats can't get into. Obviously, in general, it's better just take it away and throw it out somewhere else. So let's talk about gravity feeders. So these are great for situations where you cannot be there at the beginning and the end of the feeding, and where maybe you do have to leave food out for 24/7. Sometimes maybe you're away for the weekend. There are going to be circumstances where these gravity feeders are very useful. So a couple of tips, and they're called gravity feeders because you put the food in, and the gravity, as the food is eaten, gravity forces what's in the big container to come down into the bowl. So one tip is use the smallest feeder that you need. So if you've got 2 or 3 cats, you don't need a 20-pound gravity feeder that can hold 20 pounds of dry food. You just need one that can hold maybe 3 pounds or 6 pounds. It will keep the food fresher. Again, it will attract less wildlife and things like that. And they're just easier to manage. You want to always remember, especially if you're feeding a lot of dry food, you need to have water as well. And just like there are gravity feeders, there are auto waters that work on exactly the same principle. You fill it up and gravity causes it to come down and fill the bowl. And there especially, you don't want to get larger than you need, because if you get a 3-gallon auto waterer, that's quite a piece of equipment to lug around and to fill up, and stick to the 1 gallon. And 1 gallon of water should take care of many cats for several days. But do change the water every few days to keep it fresh. So we mentioned feeding stations, and I think these are good ideas, especially you may not need a feeding station if you're doing the feeding pattern, right? So you're coming, the cats are all showing up, you're putting down stainless steel bowls, you're putting out their food, they're eating it all, they're done in half an hour, you gather it all up and you go home. Well, you probably don't need a feeding station, but you may still want one for the water. And if you're not doing the feeding pattern, or you're not doing it all the time, and you need to leave a gravity feeder with dry food or a big pan of dry food, whatever it might be, behind, it's much better to have them in a container of some sort. It's much neater. It protects the food and the water from the elements. So what is a very common feeding station is a regular storage bin. You want to get Sterilite is a good brand. Rubberneck is a good brand. Tougher ones that will withstand being outdoors in the weather. If you can get them with clamp-on lids, the handles clamp on at the top that will help keep the lid on in the wind. If not, you want to maybe put a couple of bricks on top of the feeding station to keep it in place. Probably the biggest tip to take away from this is the opening of the feeding station should be pretty large, because you don't want the dominant cat in the colony to enter through a small opening and then decide, I'm going to hang out in here and keep everybody else out. So they can't do that if you have a big opening or if you have a couple of smaller openings. So there's more than one way in or out. Here's some other ideas for feeding stations. You can take a trash can, a Rubbermaid trash can, put it on its side, maybe use a couple of cinder blocks to hold it in place. And boom, you've got a great feeding station. 8-size storage bin from 18 to 55 gallon can be turned into one. You can do it yourself, make one out of plywood. And for those who really don't want to deal with making your own, you can order a small or a large one from a company called Ferrovia. And the link is ferrovia.com. And they'll send it to you, and you'll just need a screwdriver to put it together. And they're extremely well made. They're worth the money if that's the route you want to go. I also want to introduce one other idea to you. This is something that we learned at Neighborhood Cats. We were responsible for, after the wildfire in Maui about a year ago, it burnt down the town of Lahaina. So Neighborhood Cats was in charge of coordinating the rescue of what turned out to be over 600 cats who were in the burn zone. And one of the ways we did this is we turned drop traps like you see here into feeding stations. And we taught the cats to eat inside the drop traps. And then when we wanted to catch them, we put the side door on and used a remote control, or you can use a string. And we caught them when they were inside the drop traps eating. So think about that, especially if you're at the beginning of working with a colony and you have a situation where you can leave a drop trap out. Notice that we put a roof on. That's very important for this to be an effective feeding station. It has to have a roof. We use corrugated plastic that you can buy sheets of at Home Depot or Lowe's, and then zip tied it onto the top of the drop trap. And really what we found was the cats loved this space. They had no problem going into it. Sometimes we had cats who just liked to hang out in there. It became like a big play space for them. Only took generally like maybe 3 days to train them to go all the way into the back and eat there. So that's what you're doing at the beginning of being trained to eat inside one of these. So the dish of food is at the front. Kitty just has to stick his head in. Then we're going to move it to the middle. And then when he's eating in the middle, we're going to move the pan all the way to the back.
Start your 2025 with a purr-focused purpose. Join us for the 8th Annual Online Cat Conference on January 25th and 26th, a 2-day virtual event designed to give you the tools and knowledge to make a real difference for cats in your community. Here's what's in store. Inspiring speakers sharing success stories and expert advice, actionable strategies to elevate your advocacy efforts, and the chance to connect with fellow cat lovers and grow together. Whether you're a seasoned cat champion or just starting your journey, this is your opportunity to learn from the best and create lasting change for our feline friends. Don't wait. Register now at communitycatspodcast.com. Some highlights. Vicki Halls of International Cat Care will be talking about the jigsaw puzzle of sustainable and effective cat population management. Rebecca Burley of Pennies for People, Animals, and Wildlife Shelters will lead a compassion fatigue workshop with practical applications. You'll also go globetrotting with Bryan Kortis of Neighborhood Cats. Consider community kittens with Rosemarie Crawford of the National Kitten Coalition. And get the latest on feline leukemia from FELV expert Margaret Tompkins of the Tompkins Foundation. That's just a few of the speakers who'll be sharing their knowledge at the online cat conference. Again, visit communitycatspodcast.com to learn more and register today. That's communitycatspodcast.com. We can't wait to see you there.
Are you getting your message across to your entire community? Do they know what programs you offer and what they can do to help? Learn more about how to effectively market your organization or just sharpen your skills with a free self-paced marketing course, The Fundamentals of Marketing on Maddie's University. The course is designed to provide a basic understanding of marketing and provide you with templates and tools to elevate and improve your organization's brand, voice, and audience, and have fun while doing it. You'll receive a strategic marketing plan template to download free. Go to university.maddiesfund.org and search marketing to enroll now. Did you know that attending one of our upcoming events could be completely free? At the Community Cats Podcast, we're proud to offer scholarships for many of our virtual workshops and conferences so everyone who cares for cats can participate. Whether you're looking to develop new skills, connect with experts, or increase your impact in the community, these scholarships make it easy for everyone to participate. All you need to do is apply. New opportunities are added regularly, so be sure to visit communitycatspodcast.com/event-scholarships. You never know what might be available, and filling out a simple application form could give you access to an event that will help you change the lives of cats in your neighborhood. We'd like to thank generous sponsors like Maddie's Fund, the Tompkins Foundation, the Joni Bernard Foundation, and others for making these learning opportunities possible. That's communitycatspodcast.com/event-scholarships. Don't miss out. Apply today. Let's keep cats where they belong, at home with their families. Join us for the Surrender Prevention Certification Workshop on Wednesday, January 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. A live online event designed to give you the feline behavior tools to reduce cat intake. Led by feline behaviorist Dr. Rachel Geller, this workshop explores real-world strategies to tackle common challenges like litter box issues, destructive scratching, and inter-cat aggression that often lead to surrender. Plus, you'll learn how to compassionately help cat owners overcome barriers like time, finances, or patience. Registration is just $10 for this can't-miss opportunity to make a real difference for cats and their people. Registration also includes access to recordings, an exclusive Facebook group for networking, extensive, helpful handouts, a short quiz, and a digital certificate when you pass. Sign up and earn your surrender prevention certificate today at communitycatspodcast.com/keepthecat.
Now, if you're wondering, well, how do I use the side door? Most people are used to the drop trap being propped up in front and pulling a string. They're not that familiar with using the side door instead. So we have a free webinar in partnership with the Community Cats Podcast on the drop trap. And in that webinar, it goes over all things drop trap, but we do discuss side door trapping and how to do that. Another idea for you, we're getting into a little more esoteric, but still we like to be creative here. You can get one of these mock rocks and get a jigsaw and make sure you have the correct blade. Talk to the guy at Home Depot and say, what kind of blade do I need to cut fiberglass or resin or whatever it is. I think you need a fine metal blade, but check with them. Anyway, then you can use the jigsaw to cut a doorway for the cats to get into one of these. And you can just blend your feeding station right into the landscape. If you order one, they're not cheap. I mean, probably about $150. But again, if you can afford it and it works for you, great. And they come larger than that too. You can also do it yourself. Go onto YouTube and do a search for make a fake hollow rock, and you'll see a whole bunch of videos on how to make your own, which is obviously going to be a lot cheaper. Some other tips for you. Let's say you don't have a feeding station and it's raining, and so the cats are not coming out, and this is the time, and you have to put the food down and get on your way. You can take a bowl like you see here. This is a takeout dish from a takeout restaurant, and you fill it with dry food, and then you take the lid and you turn it upside down. So the lid will protect the dry food from the rain. And when the rain stops, the cats will come out, they'll smell the food, and they'll just easily push the lid off the top of the bowl. And there you go. If you want to store dry food on site, if you're able to do that safely so that it stays there, you can use what's called Vittles vaults. And these are containers that really do keep the dry food quite fresh. So you can fill that up and keep it there. We suggest that you don't leave the Vittle vault out in the open, but put it in a storage bin. So it's a little more discreet and a little more protected. Another good tip for those of you who are feeding in awkward places, like through fences and stuff like that, an arm extender can be very handy. It's just a $10 item you can get on Amazon. But for example, when I had to feed through a fence, I would use an arm extender, and I would push the food and push the water so that it was out of arm's reach of the sidewalk. So people could see it, but they couldn't reach it, which just made it a little bit safer. We're coming up on the wintertime in North America. So it's going to start getting colder in a lot of parts of the country. So keep in mind that cats expend more calories in colder temperatures. They need to move around more. So they need an average, the research shows, of about 15% more food. So you want to up the quantity of food that you're giving them just a little bit more. And like I said before, avoid when you're getting near or below freezing temperatures, don't use metal bowls unless they're heated, because get their tongue stuck on them. Doesn't happen often, but it just has to happen once. If you ever do get a cat that is stuck on something metal, you want to pour warm water over them, over their tongue and over whatever the metal object is that will melt basically the ice that has formed that's getting them stuck. So water in wintertime, healthy cats need some water. They don't need a lot of it, but they do need some on a daily basis. And if your main source of food is dry food, which it often is going to be in cold weather, it's really important to have a regular water source. So one thing you could do is, if you got the cats on a feeding pattern, you can, at the beginning of your meal, even if it's very cold temperatures, you can give them a little bit of wet food with some water mixed in, maybe a little bit of warm water mixed into it. And so they can eat that right away and get their moisture content. But if you still want to be able to leave water out, there are ways to either stop water from freezing or at least slow it down significantly. And here's a few ideas for you. So there's something called a solar sipper, and it basically captures the heat of the sun and stores it so that it will keep the water from freezing down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. There's also a product called a Snuggle Safe, and that's designed for pet cats to have something warm to sleep on. You can also stick it in your microwave, heat it up, and it stays warm for quite a while, and then stick it under the water bowl at the colony site. And it will keep the water from freezing for at least some period of time, sometimes a few hours, sometimes less, but still it will slow down the freezing. And then if it's your backyard colony and you've got an outlet, you can use an electric heated water bowl and completely prevent freezing from happening. The only word of warning with electric heated bowls is make sure you get a big one. And that's because the water will evaporate much faster than normal because it's going to be much warmer than the surrounding air. It doesn't evaporate all the way. You need a lot of it in there, and get a big one. Don't get a little electric water bowl. Here's some more do-it-yourself, easier or less expensive ideas. Just the kind of bowl you use to put your water in is going to have a big effect on how long it takes to freeze. So the deeper the bowl and the wider the bowl and the thicker the plastic, so the more insulation, the slower the freezing process will take. So the larger the surface of the water and the deeper the water goes, the slower it's going to freeze. You can also put your water bowl, if you want to combine a couple of things, get one of these styrofoam coolers. Buy one of those in the summertime when these are available. People take them to the beach and they put their soda and their beer in them or whatever it is. They're relatively inexpensive. Cut a doorway in one of the short sides and put your water bowl inside of this. So the bowl will slow the freezing, and then the styrofoam will keep the air insulated and also slow down the freezing process. Another idea is go to your veterinarian, ask them for one of the styrofoam containers that vaccines are shipped to them in. And what you're going to do is you're going to line the inside of that box with plastic and then cut a little opening, a round opening in the top so that the cats can drink the water through the hole on top. And the styrofoam container will, again, significantly slow down the freezing process. If you got a lot of snow and you want to clear a path for your cats, that's always a good idea, especially when the snow is higher than they are. So rock salt and chemical de-icers, what people typically use to de-ice sidewalks and things like that, they can be highly irritating and toxic to cats. So here's a safe solution. Get some Dawn dish detergent, some rubbing alcohol, mix it up with a half gallon of warm water, and then spray that or pour that on ice. And that will de-ice your path or your sidewalk, and it's completely safe for the cats. Let's talk about insects a little bit. Big problem that caretakers often have is ants getting into the food. And there's an easy way around that, which is just keep in mind that ants can't swim. Okay? So they can't cross water. You can go onto Amazon. If you do a search for ant-proof pet bowls, you'll get like 103 choices, and they all operate on that same principle, which is the food is in a bowl that has basically a moat of water around it. You can also just build your own. We took a cookie pan and just a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch of water and put the bowl in the middle of the cookie pan, and ants will not be able to get into that, but the cats can easily lean over and eat their meals. Here's another idea that we developed again in the burn zone in Maui, where we did have to leave large quantities of dry food out for the cats, and there were tons of ants everywhere. So it's what we call a pan in a pan moat. So you start on the left there. You've got 1 liter pan and put a couple of small food bowls in it. Not fill it, but maybe an inch of water and water in the bowls, and then take another similar size pan and put it on top of the bowls and inside the pan with the water. And that worked quite well to prevent any types of insects from crawling into the dry food. And this, of course, went inside of a storage bin feeding station. What about flies? They're tough, but knowledge is power, right? So on a hot day, they're going to be much more attracted to wet food than they are to dry. So if you've got a real fly problem and it's a real hot day and you have to put food out in the middle of it, you're probably better off with dry food. The other trick is they sleep at night, the flies. So if you train the cats to eat at sundown, at least during the summertime, you'll be able to avoid issues with flies. Now, for the caretaker who has everything and you're trying to find them a Christmas present, think about a wireless auto feeder. These things are really cool. You can program it on your smartphone. So it's like a gravity feeder, right? Where you fill up the container with the food, but you can then on your smartphone decide when the food comes out. And you can get one that has 2 bowls if you have multiple cats. And you can, I think, I forget how many meals you can set it for, but quite a few. So you can decide if you can't be there to put the food out at a specific time, you can use this device. Of course, it's a bit of a luxury and you have to be able to put it in a place where somebody else isn't going to walk away with it. Just a fun idea for you to know about. Now, what about slugs? Also, slugs, snails, any kind of slimy, crawly animal that likes the food too. To keep them out of the cat food is what's called diatomaceous earth. And diatomaceous earth is actually these microscopic kind of shell, marine type of animals, but they're literally microscopic. And the diatomaceous earth, even when you touch it with your hand, it's going to feel very smooth, like baby powder or something like that. But it's actually made up of zillions of sharp edges on the microscopic level. So if you take diatomaceous earth and you draw a circle with it around your food bowls, slugs and ants and any kind of animal is not going to cross that path because it will be too painful for them. So it's great. It's great stuff. You can also use crushed eggshells or chalk powder. Does the same idea, sheet of sandpaper. 2 words of warning about diatomaceous earth. Number 1, only get what's called food grade. You can see on the bag here how it's marked food grade, because there's another form that's called pool, POOL grade, that has a completely different purpose and is not safe for animals, but this is. So if they ingest it into their digestive system, actually it will just kill parasites and things like that, but it won't harm them. So only food grade. The other thing is when you're spreading it out as a human, you don't want to be inhaling it because remember, it's millions of microscopic sharp edges and you don't want those in your lungs. And in fact, in extreme cases, people have died from inhaling large amounts of diatomaceous earth because it ripped up their lungs. So either wear a dust mask or spread it in a way where it's not getting up in the air. We recommend wear a dust mask and just be safe. Now, another thing you can do with slugs that I found is if you put some food on the ground near, maybe a couple of feet away from the food bowl, they're smart. They'll go eat that. They don't want to have to make the effort of climbing up into the bowl if they don't have to. So cats could use a little help often in the wintertime with having a warm, dry place to bed down and to hang out. So it's really an important thing to make sure they have if you're in a cold climate. There are 3 qualities to any winter shelter that are going to make it effective. 1, it's going to be waterproof. Number 2, it's going to be well insulated. And number 3, which is well insulated, that means made of something that traps heat. So thick styrofoam is always a big favorite. The third thing, though, is minimal empty airspace. So the way these shelters work is the cats go in, the shelter traps their body heat, and then it keeps it in there. That's where the good insulation comes in. And their bodies actually are like little radiators that heat up the space. So the number of cats and the size of the shelter have to match so that there's not too much empty space. So for the cats to heat up. So if you have 1 cat in a shelter that can hold 6 of them, it's not going to be warm in there because the 1 cat's not going to generate enough body heat. On the other hand, if you had 4 or 5, 6 cats in there, they would all be very toasty. So make sure that the size of the shelter is matching the number of cats and avoid things like dog houses, which are tall and have a lot of empty space above where the cats are lying. So most good winter shelters are not going to be much taller than like 12 inches, maybe 18 inches at the absolute most. There's a ton of creativity in the field about designing winter shelters, and we've collected a lot of that on our website at neighborhoodcats.org. So if you click on that link, it'll take you to our feral cat winter shelter page. What you're looking at in this slide is basically a 2-foot by 8-foot sheet of styrofoam insulation that's 2 inches thick. And you need a table saw so you get good straight cuts, but you take that 2-foot by 8-foot sheet, cut it up, and then silicone glue it back together. And you've got this great shelter. And you can see, you can get really fancy with it. This is a shelter building workshop that we held. And you can see there's a linoleum tile on the floor. Makes it easier to clean. A particular person put, some type of wallpaper on the insides, again, to make the walls scratch proof and easier to clean, although you really don't have to get that fancy. Anyway, it ends up being a nice shelter that can hold up to 4 cats. I've even seen more, like 5 or 6 packed in there on a extremely cold night. But you can get the plans on our website, step by step, how to build one of these. Another idea that's simpler is styrofoam boxes. So there's a lot of, especially food items, perishable food items, like Omaha Steaks ships their stuff in these big styrofoam boxes. They're great. They're usually about 1.5 inches thick in terms of the thickness of the styrofoam. And you can just take the top of the box, and we recommend gluing it on to make sure that it's sealed and waterproof, but you glue the top on, and then you put a coat of a deck paint that you use to blend the shelter into the surroundings. And take either a steak knife or a jigsaw, but you just need a steak knife really, or a box cutter. And you don't need a jigsaw. Styrofoam is very soft. And cut open about a 6 by 6 inch square door in one of the short sides, stuff it with straw. And you got a great winter shelter. This size probably hold 1 or 2 cats. Another thing you could do is combine styrofoam with a storage bin. The great thing about the storage bin is you don't have to cut the styrofoam so precisely. It can be the walls can be loosely lined, as you see here. And this is a 1-inch styrofoam as opposed to a thicker one. Although you can use thicker if you want to. It just will take away more of the interior space, obviously. So the walls are lined with the styrofoam. There's a styrofoam roof that goes on top. And then the lid of the storage bin goes on top of that. And you cut open a door with a box cutter through the styrofoam and through the storage bin. Again, you want to keep the doors small. 6 inches by 6 inches should be plenty. We often get the question of should there be 2 doors in a winter shelter so that if a coyote comes along or a predator or a raccoon or something like that, the cats are not trapped inside. And generally what we say is no, unless the threat of coyotes or other animals is really high, because the bigger risk is going to be the drafts that are created by having 2 openings. Even if you have flap doors over them, you could still get drafts, and there's more of a risk of the cats getting sick from cold drafts than they are of getting hunted by a coyote or something like that. On the other hand, if you are in an area where lots of coyotes, especially, or predators for cats, then probably not a bad idea to have an escape hatch. We talk about flaps. Flaps are just something that you would put over the door, like a piece of vinyl, something that you can either tape or screw on over the doorway, and then the cats pull it back in order to enter the shelter. Those are great, but you want to make sure you add them after the cats are used to going in and out of the shelter, not beforehand, because you want them to know they want to get inside and they'll figure out how to pull the flap back. But initially they might not. Also, to get the cats started, you might sprinkle a little bit of catnip inside and entice them in that way. The plans for this particular shelter are on our website. For those of you who would rather buy a pre-made one, I refer you to Feral Via again. And it's an excellent winter shelter. And I think this one has a design where they enter on the ground, but then the actual shelter is up. There's a little level where the shelter is up off the ground, the floor area. But you would order this, they would ship it to you, and you would, again, just need a screwdriver to put it together. Want to point out emergency winter shelter in case that's a situation you're in. There's a storm coming. You can make a great temporary shelter just out of cardboard boxes. And you put a box inside a box. You stuff the space between them with folded newspaper. And then you wrap the whole thing in plastic and secure it with duct tape. And you've got a cardboard shelter that will definitely help you to ride out the storm. Again, go to our website for the exact step-by-step plans. Where you place the shelters, how you place them can be important. A couple of things in this slide. One is, gee, don't you wish they had painted those shelters, right? Because they really stand out just left as the pink styrofoam, whereas a coat of gray deck paint, they would have blended right in. The point of this slide is see how they've got the shelters facing each other. The front doors are facing each other, and then they have put pieces of plywood on top of the shelters to create like a porch, a protected like tunnel porch area. That's really handy in the wintertime because you can put food and water in that space and it will be protected. And the cats don't have to travel anywhere. They just come out of their shelters, they eat, and they can go back in. The other point is also, if you're not feeding them that way, make sure the shelters are close to the feeding station so the cats don't have to travel a long way if you can do that. Now, inside the shelters, you can put what we call insulating materials, and that helps increase the warmth of the cats, like having a blanket in bed. The main thing to understand about this is that for it to be effective, for it to make the cats warmer and not colder, they have to be able to burrow into it. If they lie on top of it, it will draw body heat out. They need to be surrounded by it. So that's why straw is so great, because they can just burrow right under it. Don't confuse straw with hay. They're not the same thing. Hay is bad. Straw is good. You can use shredded newspaper if you can't find straw. That's also something they can burrow into. But don't put flat newspaper on the floor. Don't put blankets or towels on the floor because that makes them colder, not warmer. The exception would be purr pads. Those are designed to retain body heat. So they actually become quite warm and the cats love lying on top of them. If you're in extremely cold climate, you can line the walls, the interior walls of the shelter. When you build it, line them with Mylar blankets, which are these very thin material that you can easily glue on, and it reflects the body heat back at the cat and makes them warmer that way.
That's it for this week. Please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave a review. We love to hear what you think, and a 5-star review really helps others find the show. You can also join the conversation with listeners, cat caretakers, and me on Facebook and Instagram. And don't forget to hit follow or subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss a single show. Thanks for listening, and thank you for everything that you do to help create a safe and healthy world for cats.